Have you ever walked away from a conversation with someone and felt not quite right about it? Not angry, not certain, just unsettled in a way you couldn't fully justify. Something they said didn't sit the way it should have. The story held together on the surface, but something underneath it didn't quite line up. And because you couldn't point to anything specific, you let it go. You told yourself you were probably reading too much into it. Here's what the psychology of deception actually shows. That feeling, the one you talked yourself out of, was almost certainly picking up on something real. Human beings are surprisingly poor at detecting lies when they rely on conscious analysis alone. But the body keeps a different kind of score. The discomfort you felt wasn't paranoia. Also, it was pattern recognition operating below the level of language, catching signals your conscious mind hadn't yet assembled into a clear picture. The problem is that most people, when they suspect they're being lied to, don't know what they're actually looking for. They've absorbed a lot of myths. The looking to the left thing, the nose-touching thing, the inability to make eye contact. And most of those myths don't hold up under serious research scrutiny. What the research does show is a set of psychological and behavioral patterns that are considerably more reliable, considerably more subtle, and considerably more interesting than anything you've seen on a list like this before. So if you have ever wanted to understand what's actually happening when someone isn't being straight with you, and why your instincts are probably more accurate than you've been giving them credit for, here are 7 psychological signs that someone is lying to your face. Sign 1. Their story has too much detail in the wrong places. This one tends to surprise people because the instinct is to assume that more detail means more truth. If someone can tell you exactly what they ordered for lunch, exactly what the waiter looked like, exactly what song was playing, surely that means they were actually there, right? Not necessarily. And here's why. When people tell the truth, they tend to describe events with natural gaps. Memory doesn't record experience like a camera. It captures certain moments clearly and leaves others vague, and genuine accounts reflect that unevenness. There are the parts you remember well and the parts you don't, and an honest narrator moves between them without much self-consciousness. When people construct a story, they tend to fill it in. Not because they're trying to be thorough, but because they're trying to be believed. The unconscious logic of deception is, the more specific I am, the more credible I sound. So the fabricated account often comes loaded with details that feel slightly over-prepared. Precise timestamps, vivid sensory specifics in places where a genuine memory wouldn't bother to be vivid. A level of narrative completeness that real experience rarely produces. What you're looking for is not the presence of detail, it's the distribution of it. A true account tends to be detailed where the experience was emotionally significant and vague where it wasn't. A constructed account tends to be uniformly detailed in a way that feels, if you're paying attention, a little too ready. If you've ever had that experience where a story felt almost too complete and you didn't know what to do with it, hit the like button. Because what you were sensing was real, and understanding why it felt that way changes everything about how you read people going forward. Sign 2. They answer questions with questions. Pay attention to this one the next time you suspect something is off. You ask a direct question. Instead of answering it, the person responds with a question of their own. Why do you ask? What made you think of that? Where did you hear that? And the conversation shifts, almost imperceptibly, away from the thing you actually asked about. This is not always deceptive. People ask clarifying questions for legitimate reasons. But in the specific context of a conversation where you're looking for a straight answer, the reflexive redirection of a question back at you serves a particular function. It buys time. It forces you to explain yourself, to justify the question, to potentially back away from it. And while you're doing that, the person who was asked is doing their own quiet calculation about what you know and what you don't, and what answer they can safely give. Psychologists who study deceptive communication describe this pattern as deflection under interrogative pressure. It's the conversational equivalent of stepping to the side when something is coming at you. The question wasn't answered. The topic was moved. And if you weren't tracking carefully, you might not even notice it happened. Sign 3. There's a mismatch between their words and their emotional timing. This is one of the most reliable signals in the psychology of deception, and one of the subtlest. It's not about what someone feels. It's about when they feel it. Genuine emotional responses tend to be immediate. If someone hears something surprising, the surprise registers on their face before they've had time to decide to be surprised. If something is genuinely upsetting, the distress arrives ahead of the words about it. Real emotion and the language that describes it move together. They're part of the same response. When someone is managing a deceptive narrative, the emotion and the language become slightly decoupled. The verbal expression of feeling arrives a beat late. The hurt that should have appeared immediately shows up after a pause that was spent deciding to appear hurt. The shock registers just after the face has had a moment to arrange itself. You rarely see this consciously, but you feel it. It's the source of that sense that something didn't land quite right, that the reaction was slightly performed, even when you can't point to what gave it away. The research calls this emotional leakage, the brief window between the genuine internal response and the managed external one. And learning to notice it is one of the most useful things you can do if you spend time around people whose honesty matters to you. Save this video. The next time you're in a conversation where something feels off and you can't name what it is, you're going to want to come back to these specific patterns. Because what we're building toward in the final signs is where this really sharpens into something you can actually use. Sign 4. They become unusually still or unusually animated. Most people have absorbed the idea that a liar is someone who fidgets, who can't sit still, who is visibly uncomfortable in their own body. And while that can happen, the research tells a more interesting and more nuanced story. When people lie, their cognitive load increases significantly. They're managing the story they're telling, monitoring your reaction to it, tracking what you know, maintaining emotional consistency, and suppressing the truth, all simultaneously. Under that kind of load, the body often does one of two things. It either goes unusually still, because the brain, overwhelmed by the task of managing the narrative, unconsciously reduces all other motor activity to conserve resources. Or it goes unusually animated, because the person, aware that stillness might look suspicious, overcorrects into deliberate gesturing that feels slightly disconnected from the natural rhythm of what they're saying. Neither stillness nor animation is itself evidence of lying. What matters is the deviation from the person's baseline. The person who is usually expressive and suddenly becomes flat. The person who is usually calm and is suddenly using their hands in a way that feels staged. The signal is the shift, and catching it requires knowing how someone normally moves through a conversation before you can notice when they've moved away from it. Sign 5. They over-volunteer reassurances you didn't ask for. Honest people, when they're telling the truth, tend to tell you the thing and move on. They don't feel the need to circle back and underline their own credibility because it doesn't occur to them that their credibility is in question. People who are lying often feel the need to manage your confidence in them actively. So the reassurances appear without prompting. I swear I'm being completely honest with you. You have to believe me. I would never lie about something like this. And the interesting thing is that these statements tend to arrive not at the moments where reassurance would naturally make sense, but at the moments where the story is most fragile, where the constructed account has a gap, or an inconsistency, or a claim that sounds less solid than everything around it. Thus, the reassurance is doing something specific. It's trying to paper over the exact place where the story doesn't hold, which means the frequency and placement of unprompted reassurances can function as a kind of map. pointing to the parts of the account that the person themselves is least confident in. You don't have to consciously analyze this in real time. You just have to notice when someone is working unusually hard to make you believe them and ask yourself what they might be working around. Understanding this level of human behavior, the real psychology of how people communicate, what they reveal without meaning to, and what it means for the relationships in your life, is exactly what this channel goes deeper into than most. If you want to keep going past the surface, subscribing is how that stays available to you. Sign 6. Their account doesn't change at all. Here's one that seems counterintuitive until you understand why it works. If you suspect someone isn't being straight with you, and you have the opportunity to ask about the same events more than once, across a few days or a few different conversations, pay attention not just to whether the story stays consistent, but to whether it stays identical. Genuine memory is reconstructive. Every time you recall an experience, you're rebuilding it rather than replaying it, which means a true account will have natural variation across multiple tellings, not in the major facts, but in the small details. You might remember something you left out last time. You might describe the same thing slightly differently depending on what you're emphasizing. The story stays true, but it breathes a little. It has the flexibility of something that actually happened. A constructed account tends to stay fixed because it was built once, carefully, and any deviation from the original version is a risk. So the person reproduces it as closely as possible each time. Same details, same phrasing, sometimes almost the same words. And that rigidity, that absence of the natural drift that memory produces, is one of the quietest and most telling signals that what you're hearing was prepared rather than recalled. Sign 7. Something in you already knew. This last one isn't a behavioral cue. It's something closer to an honest accounting of what you already know about yourself and how you read people. Research in social psychology is fairly consistent on this point. People are not as bad at detecting deception as the conventional wisdom suggests. What they are bad at is trusting what they detect. The conscious mind, trained to be fair, to give benefit of the doubt, to avoid the discomfort of confrontation, consistently overrides signals that the instinctive system caught correctly. You felt the mismatch. You noticed the story was too complete. You registered the reassurance that arrived without being asked for. And then you found a reason to explain it away. Because the alternative was a conversation you weren't sure you were ready to have. This is worth saying directly. Your instincts about the people close to you are probably more accurate than you typically allow them to be. Not perfect, not infallible, but tracking something real most of the time. The question is less often whether you noticed, and more often whether you let yourself take seriously what you noticed. The psychology underneath that reluctance, why we override accurate instincts, what it costs us when we do, and what it looks like to build a more honest relationship with what we actually perceive, goes deeper than one video can fully address. There's a video on this channel that gets into exactly that. The patterns underneath why we stay in situations our instincts have been flagging for a long time. That's the next layer of this conversation, and it's worth following through on. If anything in today's video named something you've been sitting with about a specific person or situation, please know that those feelings are worth taking seriously, and that speaking to someone you trust, or a professional if things feel significant, is always a valid next step. Drop a comment with the sign that made something click for you. The specific one that explained a moment you'd been replaying without knowing what you were actually seeing. Reading those responses tells the rest of this community something important, that what felt like a private confusion was something many people have lived through, and that understanding it changes things. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching.